This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave on the board. This is May the 14th, 2017, and this is the Prairie Monk WEFT's weekly look at the conservation and the environment and rails, trails, and greenways. And I have a stack of pages in front of me showing you what Dave plans to talk about in just 1 hour. So this will be a busy day.
So it's Mother's Day, and mothers are in town. And I just had a mother looking in the window, and I gave her a 2-minute field trip to the Pocket Prairie. And she's a mother, and she's here for her daughter's graduation at noon. And she comes from Finland. And so in the last little while, she's been as close as 20 meters to Russia. So this was exciting. And she's a business person. And her daughter is in business too, and she also realizes that business has the responsibility to keep the ecosystem afloat some. And she was staying at a hotel in downtown Champaign, and was taking a walk before she went to the graduation. So, and there are probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of mothers on campus today, fathers too, celebrating their sons and their daughters graduating in various different disciplines. So good luck to them, and it's fun to have them here. I thought about my own mother. I called Australia last night after David went to work with the Grateful Dead, and I having some phone difficulties with Skype, but I eventually got on with a cell phone. It's a little more expensive with a cell phone, and my family is there. My brother has Parkinson's, and can't very much talk easily. But his wife the two of them have two children. One is a television person, and the other is a homebody, but she works with companies. She's in Queensland, some distance away from Orange, which is at the centre of New South Wales. My mother grew up in Cockney land in England, and so I thought I'd say a little bit about this. I've probably said some of this before, but I don't think it hurts to say some of this again, because we're a global society, and these movements around the world have gone on for a long time. My mother grew up in Cockney land, but her mother was from Colchester, which is more rural. Her father was an Aldeburgh, and he was probably from an urban background. They had moved around some. They'd been in Italy. They had been in Wales. Both parents could recite Welsh poetry, and they'd gotten together. Father was a tailor on Savile Row, and that's a street that's well known for tailors. And England was, at the time they were married, still a very colonial body. The sun never set on the English Empire. And English citizens were encouraged to settle in the colonies, whether it be South Africa or Australia or the Caribbean or wherever the Brits were, in India or whatever. So in about 1913 or 14, when my mother was about 13, her father decided that the family should move to Sydney, Australia. They weren't given an awful lot of time to say goodbye to their friends and relatives that probably would not see again. But they left town in the early stages of World War I, so they had to avoid U-boats that were sort of early World War I German boats that could torpedo crafts. This was not in the sailing days. This was in a steamboat. So they eventually got to Canary Islands and to Cape of Good Hope, and then they took the area between the Cape of Good Hope and southeastern Australia is Indian Ocean and very windy, and it was the sailors in their day coming back from England with ballast to keep the ship afloat. They'd taken grain or commodities to England, and coming back, they invariably tried to bring back ballast, and often it was ironware that was used on verandas and in places. You see it in New Orleans. You sometimes even see it around Champaign. But it was it kept the ship afloat in fairly windy territories. And they traveled right across the Bight and eventually came to Sydney, which is a large harbour created by probably mostly the melting of ice, and it's a drowned estuary. So you have all these interesting hills and that look over a deep harbour, a very interesting harbour. And so they settled in a place called Bondi. Bondi is famous for being one of the beaches that face onto the Pacific, and it's a very nice area for swimming. I would enjoy surfing there. If you could catch a wave at just the right moment, you could have it push you right up onto the beach till your chest was scratching in the sand. Other times you had waves that you had to dodge because they could dump you and to put you in turmoil. So you got used to seeing what the nature was going to give you, and if it was a dumper, you went in under the wave and didn't try to use it to force you in towards the beach. My grandfather was a fairly upright gentleman, and he was still walking around with a top hat and tails. And in an era where most of the British people who came to Australia started out as convict era and then morphed to workers, and so often people who dressed like that were given a hard time because they were recent immigrants, and that was they would be given a hard time by it was a pommy thing where you started out with prisoners of Merry England, pommy, but then you had a lot of people from inner suburbs of Liverpool, Manchester, and places like that that were also migrating. And so grandfather started a tailoring business, but he was faced with a different style than Savile Row. Grandma had come from a background in Colchester, and some of her relatives are artists, name artists, and rather gentle background. They settled in a part of Bondi that looked over the Pacific coast and Bondi Beach in one direction and looked over the Sydney Harbour inlet on the other. So it wasn't exactly an isthmus, but it was sort of like that. So they were between both, and at the outset they were quite poor because the transport and the rest was very costly. So they occupied a house which was at the time one of the last houses in the area that still had gas lighting, no electricity. It was a duplex, and a backyard. They used to grow plants in there, and we as grandchildren enjoyed that. My mother went to art school, and she was old enough that she could go to the city markets and got astute at bargaining for pockmarked fruit and vegetables that didn't cost a lot, and she would bring those home. The other diet that the family was living on was mainly shot wheat. It allowed wheat to grow till it had a germ, and then that was good and healthy food. Mother went to art school at a technical college, which in these days has become a red brick university. But in her day, she graduated from that and worked with a rather wonderful woman named Millie Thornborough, who was a costumier person, and she had a team of 18 seamstresses, and my mother's job was to go to races or fancy places where interesting dresses were worn, and she had to sketch these dresses and come back and work with 18 seamstresses to create a second-level echelon of garments that would be less expensive but still have fashion-era qualities. And my mother enjoyed doing that, and we became friends of the family for a long, long time. Mother, for a while, enrolled as a governess. This is sort of a relief sort of thing, a different job, a different interest. She went to work with a station family, and they were far enough away from a school that the school children needed a governess or a tutor or perhaps a nurse person to educate the children. When the children got old enough, they would go to a boarding school, and all of them did. But my mother was there for a while and encountered a large station with sheep and cattle, mainly sheep. And then she came back to Bondi. The family used to attend to a congregational church where my father was the pastor. He was the 14th child, and mainly brought up by his older sister, and the family were bricklayers or often people who were what do you call them, construction type people. But they were also moving, when they had children, some of those children became barristers and legal people, and so there was a mixture in the family of rugged working class people and people who had a sophistication that was a little different. When I went to school, I didn't have a close high school. I went to school with grade school with my father's one-teacher school. But we would either go to boarding school, or my brother went to live with a relative, so that we wouldn't have to spend half a week going to high school. My father left the ministry because he felt that he wasn't as godly as his congregation. He was very interested in how the church promoted a moral code and was a mentor for that sort of thing. And he continued to do that throughout his life. He would actually fill in as a locum for people who needed to be away from their church for a while. And so he didn't leave his church situation, but he did go school teaching. And he had already had jobs in cabinet making and a whole bunch of other things. And so when you're in New South Wales, all of Australia, these teaching is controlled by the state, and if you're a recent graduate in education, you usually end up at a very distant station and gradually work your way back towards a urban situation. So my father was assigned to a little copper mining town called Gulf Creek on the central plains, the slopes and plains of a great divide, which is somewhat higher because of plate tectonics. He was the one teacher school there. And all these schools had a residence, so my mother was with the residence. We had a little farm on school grounds, and father would grow oats or things like that to feed the cow. And I can remember as a young child that he would cut trails through the oat crop so I could run and enjoy. The cow produced milk and cream, and mother would make butter for that. There were chickens and eggs and vegetables, and they enjoyed being a part of a community that included mining people, but also ranch-style people who had shearing sheds and cattle yards and things like that. The place was visited by a fruiterer or someone from the coastal plains where they had oranges and other fruit, and they would travel up over the mountain and to the plains. And that fruiterer told my father that they had a vacancy in a school on the coastal plain, and they thought that father might be able to fill the position. So he arranged that, and after probably 3, 4, 5 years at Gulf Creek, he left the slopes and plains and went down, and we were nestled at a little place called Thora underneath the escarpment. The furniture came with a wool truck, and in those days the wool truck was solid tires, and your driving seat was sort of open to the wind, and so an old Federal truck, which these days would be an antique, was loaded with furniture. Most of the furniture was made by my father, who had been a cabinet maker at one stage. And if you were on the slopes and plains there, it's reasonable soil, but when it gets wet, they're very, very slippery, and it rained. So the old truck was delayed for quite some time. They had to find some way of feeding the chickens, so they fed those chickens with bananas. And but eventually they arrived at Thora, and I can remember for all the time that we were at Thora, there were these grooves in the soil where a loaded truck had made a deep ruts in what was eventually a front lawn. But there were the remnants of where the truck had been. The fruiterer, on the other hand, had a truck with some of the early pneumatic tires. It was a little different and a lighter truck. But so my father settled in at Thora and put in orchards and gardens, and we gradually grew a herd of cattle to about 10 at most. Probably 2 or 3 were in milk at the time, and so the next door neighbor was leaving town because the coastal plain is rather infertile, except for the floodplains, which take some rich soil from the uplands. But the uplands above us were where there had been a volcanic eruption, mainly because of the Earth's movements, and it was rather rich for dairying. So you took out all the tropical rainforest and put in a dairy. So our next door neighbor had a very good cow that had calved right at that time. So that was given to me as a junior farmer cow, and she became very much a pet. And but she gave rise to all sorts of heifers and bull calves. The bull calves got purchased by local people because they felt that this was a genetic improvement. Eventually, my father taught carpentry as well as teaching school. Carpentry was part of the school, and it was in a very practical area where carpentry was rather helpful. My mother taught sewing. We didn't have running water. We had tanks that collected water off the roof, and the radio was run by battery. When Father across the road in the school would want a state broadcast that he felt was educational, he would take a hammer and hit it on a brake drum that resounded well. Mother would hear that, and she'd turn on the radio, and it would broadcast to the school children. One room sometimes would have 45 children, and sometimes less than that, 14. If the road was being developed, then there would be more people there as workers, and so the population would go up, and there were sometimes 8 different classes in the same school, and sometimes the older people helped to educate the younger people, and that went on for quite some time, and I remember those sorts of things and talk to my brother sometimes about that. My mother had 3 children. She actually had 4 children, one passed. When you had a child, often you went back to your parental area, so she went back to Bondi, and so I was born in Bondi at a maternity hospital. But there they met up with Nurse Green, and Nurse Green was a rather friendly soul, and so she took a vacation. Next child was my brother Jeff, and he was born in the boondocks with the help of Nurse Green. And my sister came on later when we moved to Thora. So we milked the cows, we fed the chickens. We didn't have hogs. We fired the stove with wood that you knew whether oak would give you this temperature and cottonwood or something else would give you another temperature. The landscape was blady grass, fairly rough and tough grass, because this was not the most fertile area. Sometimes on the flats there would be an erosion of the volcanic basalt up the road, and so the alluvial floodplains were fertile, and that's where you would get dairying and truck crops. And it was 300 miles from Sydney and about 300 miles from Brisbane, so you didn't really have a chance to sell crops easily unless they could travel. So we had potatoes and peas and beans, and the milk was converted to butterfat, and the butterfat could be shipped, especially with a lot of salt, to create exosmosis, so you didn't get bacteria and fungi in your butter. But so all the cream went to about 2 butter factories in the area. The separated milk was fed to hogs, and along with a little bit of corn and other crops like beans, cowpeas, and the like. So we grew up with modest means and enjoyed doing that, and mothering was a part of that. We had a little veranda, and we would sit there for breakfast time and be joined by woolly wagtails and wrens and other creatures that knew that my father would flick a little piece of bread to them, and sometimes we would have a visitor of a bird of paradise or something, some creature that came out of the rainforests that were nearby. We woke up to a 2,000-foot mountain, and sometimes that mountain would spontaneously burn because lightning would strike the accumulated litter, and you'd see a whole mountain on fire. So we were used to fires. The roads were gravel. Sometimes they had bull dust. Most everyone, including adults, often wore no shoes. We have broad feet, and would have a gristly sole to the feet so that you didn't get stone blisters and things like that. So the rainfall was about 80 inches of rain, and that meant that things were muddy often. So you wore clothes that dried on you, and you walked around in mud sometimes, and you got used to that. There was a post office with a public telephone outside, and there was a gas pump, and there was the Bellinger River that ran along the escarpment and out to the coast, and a rather beautiful rolling area where artists came to paint. And after 13 years, the education system decided to consolidate its schools and bus children to a larger school, which meant that my parents had to move from that little town to another town and then another town. And eventually they ended up on the Great Divide, on that escarpment, just near to Sydney, about 60 miles west of Sydney, where you went up the hill. And that mountain in that situation was rather difficult to cross. So the earliest explorers were Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson. So the towns where my people settled in retirement time were Blaxland, Wentworth, and Lawson. And these it meant that you could get across that mountain and then on the slopes. My brother lives on the slopes, and his wife grew up on the slopes just west of a city called Orange. And it's high enough at Orange on the country divide for there to be snow and at times, but not a lot. Our highest mountain on that range is Mount Kosciuszko, and it's only about 7,000 feet. So it's not; these are not the highest mountains in the world, but they're enough to catch rain as it comes across from the Indian Ocean across the deserts of Australia, and then they raise up, and then they fall as rainfall, and some of the water goes fast out to the sea and some goes slowly into the hinterlands. And the Australians have a seventh wonder of the world where they capture that fast-moving water and channel it to the west, and every time it falls down, it generates electricity. So I got an agriculture degree, or I went to boarding school at an agricultural high school, and I'd grown up with agriculture and became an agricultural educator who taught at one of these agricultural boarding schools. And before I decided I wanted to visit the U.S. and get a higher degree, and I'd been by that time I'd been teaching in a college which was an agricultural specialty college, and it has since then been converted to a red brick university with more biodiversity, more nursing and teaching and other disciplines. But at the time, there was a fair gap between the academic University of Sydney, where I had attended, and the applied agricultural college, which often learned things by rote. And I came partially because I wanted to combine art and education and science and bridge that gap a little bit so that the students got more involvement with science. So when they went out, they would have rules of thumb, and they could go into a field and say, this is paspalum or whatever it is, and it does this and so. The academic would go into the same field and say, I don't know anything about this field, but I will research it and find out about it. Much more mathematics, physics, chemistry, and a background. So the academic would not go out of date so quickly, but the applied persons would sometimes lose contact with what they had learned to start with, and were not as in a same position to research the change and the like. So well, when I came here, I was also looking for, as I do in Australia, the ecosystem. Australia has a tremendously beautiful ecosystem. It's rather unique. It knows how to live on very poor soils. And I'd grown up with that. My parents had grown up with that, and I wanted to find out about the ecosystem. But when I came, I found that most of the Midwestern ecosystem in the U.S. was corn and soybeans. And eventually I found where the prairie was, and it was along railroad lines, active or passive, and abandoned. And so I got bitten by the bug of trying to preserve some of the dignity of that genetics, and have been here ever since. That took me away from Australia, just as my mother had been a Cockney and went to the Palace School with stairs of concrete which were worn down, so that they were very different and not as rectilinear as when they were put in many years ago. So my mother had to go from England to Australia, and then when my father died, she went back to England and enjoyed doing that. But I've been here, and I haven't been back to Australia very much. So you think about that as you pass on something like a family event like Mother's Day. That's sort of as a background to a plant sale that was yesterday. Some of the things we used to do as preservation under the edict of the natural areas interests, and working within the framework of the university using revolving accounts. We would service various different departments that had contingency money. When that dried up, some we came to downtown Champaign, and at that time there were 4 empty buildings on Market Street, and we had hoped that we would have 4 non-profit agencies here. Didn't exactly happen, but WEFT came, and they're still here, and we're here, and the agencies to the north and south, Rubel's Pogo Studios that are being remodeled at the present time, and that's related, and sometimes those studios have landlines to WEFT, and to the south we have a range of different people there. So from that base we have gathered up old railroad beds, and one of them is going into action at the present time as the Kickapoo Trail, and that's very interesting, and I'll deal a little bit of that later because it's a very, very wide trail adjacent to a highway, and it's removed most of the remnant prairie that the university used to rent for graduate student and prairie work, and so disappointing to see that remnant prairie where we are down to very, very little left, destroyed for a wide trail. And if you have a trail, what are people going to look at? Part of what they look at is, or should be what they look at, is the prairie that is part of their heritage. So in the framework of trying to promote interpretation of prairie, we work with little prairies at places like Rantoul or Monticello, and that has helped people to understand. More recently, there has been, we've created a formal attempt to, it took us a while to do it because you don't just walk into a different country and tell people what to do, but we created a Grand Prairie Friends. We walked between Leroy and Lafayette to try on a pumpkin vine line that was closing out, with the hope of finding some prairie that would be close enough that it was remnant, probably still disturbed because it's very narrow, only 100 feet wide. But we settled on a 1 mile short line prairie, and at that time we had a prairie conference at Mahomet, and people were willing to start a Grand Prairie Friends. So we started a Grand Prairie Friends. I kept out of it because even though my attorney had wanted me to be there, because I thought that this ought to be an organization that promoted prairie, and Bob Dodworth had been chair of, or mayor of Champaign, and had a knowledge of what we did, and was very supportive and did things for us pro bono, and encouraged us. And he thought that I ought to be there because at least I knew something about the prairie that I'd been involved with, and I didn't feel like I should be breathing down the neck of a new organization. We'd hoped that it would be an organization to promote prairie, and they have done so. They have plots of prairie at Loader and Watseka and other places. They have morphed some into forest, but that has been because there's been donations, there's been opportunities, and it's matured the Grand Prairie Friends to the point that they are almost a legitimate trust. They may even be a legitimate trust. At least they can take over areas, and they've worked very diligently to have stewards and good board proceedings that sometimes are lacking in Heartland Pathways, and they've introduced a lot of people to a lot of the things that we were doing rather in a primitive way. So they on Saturday were having a sale of plants, and these This means that they've gotten together a lot of. Jamie Ellis is the president, and there's a healthy board, and they arrange to germinate and then pot plants. And by 7 o'clock in the morning, they had a load of plants in Lincoln Square. And here again is a early mall that's sort of smaller than the typical malls that we have on North Market Street in Champaign, or North Prospect, or Matters Avenue. All those are big box malls, and so they've taken some of the strength out of the Lincoln Square Mall. But it has these different events, and last week we had Kevin Kelly here, and we're talking about the youth orchestra that was there. And so on Saturday it was not only the Grand Prairie Friends, but it was the horticultural people were also there. And they were selling well, but I got there at 8 o'clock, and by that time there was a lineup of people waiting to pay for their plants. Plants sold at about $4 each, and you could get a discount if you took a flat. And so I was very pleased with that. By the time it came to noon or 1 o'clock, the benches were almost free of plants. One of the things that has happened is that the wanderer butterflies or monarch butterflies, as they're known here, having a rough time, and it might be partially due to nature, but partially it's due to the lack of habitat. So people have been encouraged to put in butterfly gardens, and also the bee population is having a problem. So there's bee gardens. They're slightly different gardens. The bee population needs often cultivar plants that have honey or nectar and pollen, and the butterfly gardens often, if you're trying to encourage a monarch, need milkweeds that are the host to the small caterpillar that then insists. And my, if you look at the chrysalis that goes with, that's the egg larva chrysalis an adult. It's just a jewel. And but the larvae work on milkweeds, and so there were milkweeds, several types of milkweed, Sullivan's milkweed. Other milkweeds include a rather showy orange milkweed that is rather popular. And so over the last few years, they've run out of these plants, but there were many of them yesterday. And it was a friendly place where people get to meet each other and talk to each other. I met up with people that I'd met in various situations which I've been involved with over the years. Like we used to teach a course called Reading the Landscape, and some of those people have attended that sort of program. So now what do they have? They had a whole rectilinear square of plants, tables, with them well labeled, and pictures of the plant as an adult plant, because this is early in the season and you're planting little plants you don't even know to recognize what they are. But the plant's individual pot is labeled with the plant name, and there were people there that would tell you, so this is Joe Pye weed. It might be suitable for a shady situation. There were some of the horticulturists had Jack in the Pulpit and bloodroot and trillium that were sort of forest edge plants or forest plants. There might be the grasses. Some people didn't want to have too many grasses because they were looking at pollinations. So they wanted plants that are broadleaves and that flower. But traditionally, the grasses were probably about 70% of a prairie. So if you went out in the fall and you watched the wind blow across a prairie, there was a grassland plants that are 8 feet tall, and they will wave, and you could almost see the wind rustle through the landscape. And so in some circles, early in the 60s, people planted prairie grasses. The guidebooks from the Department of Transportation working with roadsides and people working with landscaping were often encouraged to plant the grasses, which do grow very well, very quickly, very easily, and but in some cases, it's not so biodiverse. In fact, some of those old plots that were planted early on have been dug out in order to allow the broadleafs. So there's about 110 broadleafs. If you have thousands of acres of prairie, you will probably reach up into the hundreds for different species. If you're on a railroad bed and you only have 25 miles with just the edges on either ballast, then you're not going to get 100 species, but you can replicate these situations. We try to mainly preserve remnants that might have 5, 6, 7, 8, or perhaps 50 species, and they're rather rare. The reconstruction prairies can sometimes help restore remnant prairies that have been invaded by species of weeds that come in with settlement. The area prairie doesn't come to fruition for buffalo and the like till in about June. So that area needed to be covered. The traditional farmers that came in from Europe wanted to have their cattle calve in March, and they would need fodder. So many of the plants that are invasive for prairie are those plants that were brought in to bridge that gap between the early spring and the native vegetation that grew in later June through to September and November. So there's in that farming group of introduced European species, there are clovers, and one of them is a sweet clover that is prized by the Italian bee group because it's very lucrative in terms of honey. But as far as preserving a biodiverse prairie with broadleaves in it, it's very competitive. It could be mown for 8 times a year, and every time you mowed it, it's kind of enjoyed it and resprouted. So it's hay for cattle to feed on, but it's invasive. So as spring comes, I can see the remnants of the introduction of those species. So there's a little bit of difference between the pollinators, the butterfly people, and the true prairie people. But there were I was buying plants for someone who is interested in putting prairie around his house in Urbana. And so we've had lots of conversation with Mike, and he has to also realize that how does he put this in? Does he plant it into a regular plot? Does he dig it up? In actual fact, a lot of prairie plants are able to handle fairly firm soil. And if you have a prairie that's been around for 10,000 years, it's dynamic, it changes it, but its seeds are able to germinate in fairly firm soils. If you disturb the soil, like plow it up, which often happens along roadsides, you encourage those cultivars that were brought in, so that it includes the crops, the hay crops and the like, and it encourages the weeds that came in with those crops. So often the weeds are not indigenous weeds; they're introduced weeds. So you have to have techniques to battle that. One of them is to not put fertilizer in, which really is enjoyed by weeds and cultivars that have almost been trained to take advantage of fertilizer. The prairie does quite well in a less nutrient-loaded soil. So watch what you do with fertilizer. It doesn't necessarily encourage the prairie plants. Then you need to know that if you have weeds, you can mow them out. When they're just about to flower and to seed, you cut them off. One of the weeds that is quite beautiful at the present time, you can see it on Route 10, is Dame's Rocket. It's a crucifer. It belongs to the cabbage family. It has 4 petals, so thus the name crucifer. And it's blue. It has a counterpart that's a mustard, and they beautify the prairie, but it's often mistaken as a prairie plant. If you have that elegant weed, then I was talking to Meg Miller, and she is cunning. She waits till it flowers, and then she takes the flowers and uses them in vases inside so that they just don't get to seed. Because these plants have been brought into yards by people who enjoyed them being there, but they kind of a little bit in a invasive style. The prairie itself has some plants that can be invasive. If you have a sawtooth sunflower, for instance, it can go walking. If it's 18 feet tall, it falls down and creates a nest for growing a sawtooth sunflower 20 feet away, and then so it walks, and you can have a sunflower prairie that is rather dominant with Helianthus plants. That's the botanical family for sunflowers. So I'm very cautious. I don't buy black-eyed Susans or sunflowers that I know are going to be invasive. And now you have to know that we have rabbits and we have squirrels. So Mike Chuli, who's putting in this corridor, has cages, and he's going to develop more, that he'll put wire netting, and you almost need wire netting that is half-inch in diameter rather than half-inch holes, because a small rabbit can get through a 1-inch hole netting. But you create these boxes that you put over the plants. The plants that are on sale are probably fairly juicy and very attractive, especially if they're legumes, and they're good for the nutrition of rabbits. So you're in danger if you want to put the plants out in the wilderness. And if you have 10,000 acres and you put a plant in, it's not going to get zapped by a deer or a rabbit. It can be, but it's much less a chance. But if you're in a small urban setting, then you have many more of these animals, because they too have come to town, because there's not much habitat out there for creatures. So now where do you put this? Do you put rectilinear garden beds in that are perhaps 6 or 8 or 2 feet high. If it's 2 feet high, that sort of negates the rabbits some. But you can also plant into the existing lawn. Is that going to mean that the weeds that are in the lawn are going to, or in the lawn itself is going to continue? Well, yes, but the prairie eventually will take over, and you'll be able to weed it. And the cover is rather important. So I've been. Also, we have pots. Sometimes the pots have prairie plants in them. We've actually had pots outside of Weft and outside of Heartland Pathways, and they give the street some sort of expression. And things like monarda or bee balm are favoured by bees. But there's this sort of planting on the streetscape, which is somewhat independent, is not awfully favoured by the city, so we retreat to vacant plots like the one that houses the pocket prairie. So those pots can also be put in a situation on a garden prairie and left there till you want to put them in. You can also go to a prairie that has existing plants and dig a plant out if you know that you're not destroying a site that is a preservation site. And a big blue stem, you can go around it with a shovel, a pointed shovel that goes down, and then you get several people at once on shovels, and you break the roots off. The roots are probably, by the time the plant is fairly mature, probably a mile of rootlets there. And you can take that plant and with enough soil and put it in a pickup truck, and you can put that in. And that gives you instant gratification, which is rather helpful because the prairie plants are fairly slow to grow. They're perennials, though, and that saves you. You don't have to plant your pansies in spring and then replace them with zinnias and all that, which gets to be costly for city park districts and the like.
45 seconds.
Wow! So I was very pleased with the event that was going on at Windsor in Lincoln Square, and I hope you get involved too. You got to watch that you don't have too much shade in your yard. Then you'll have to have shade plants. But you can grow a prairie and be interested. You have to know what to look for, and it can be an enjoyable thing. So I think we've come to the end. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.